Hey, what's up? Editing Emily here. Obviously, this video was filmed, which you'll see in a second, at the beginning of March. And the beginning of March was a completely different time, so take this first part of video with a grain of salt and hopefully a laugh. I had a hard time reading. You'll see I have a few emotional moments overall, just as I'm kind of easing myself into the way that we're living now. But I also want to preface this with, I hope you're all healthy and safe, and I hope this video, in its weird mix of personal and reading, a bit of a different tone on my channel, but I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. So here you go, here's the video. Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm gonna show you guys and tell you about my first secret TBR. I've been working on this for a while. I've been bouncing a few ideas around about Twilight and Twilight books and Twilight related content. So today I'm sharing with you guys my TBR. I'm hoping to finish these all by the end of March, but track record isn't looking too great for the beginning of 2020 in reading so far. I'm a pretty big fan of Twilight. It's one of my problematic faves. Obviously, it's 2020. I recognize all the things that are wrong with Twilight, such as racism and controlling relationships. I totally recognize that. If you follow me on Twitter, I threw myself a Twilight birthday party when I turned 23 back in November. It was called Forever 23. I had a fantastic time. From my undergrad, I've been exposed to like the origins of Twilight, which is vampires and the Gothic era of literature. And I never got a chance to really dive into that a lot in university. One of my favorite books to come out of university was Frankenstein. I want to know more. So what all this rambling is concluding to is that I want to read the most classic, most popular vampire novels in time up to Twilight. I'm going to read these in order of publication from the oldest book up to Twilight. So there's no book in here that's newer than Twilight. I also wanted to kind of keep it like classic, like I guess adult in a way. I'm gonna start with Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, I think is how you say it. This was published in 1872. It's a lot shorter than I expected it to be. This book is actually public domain in the US now. I would assume Canada as well. But I didn't know that. And I only got this for $4. I actually didn't pay for any of these. I had gift cards. If you're wondering how my no-buy is going, I did not spend any money on these. I'm excited to read this. I don't know exactly what it's about. I was told by a friend it has like gay undertones and that she really liked it. So I'm actually really looking forward to this being the first book that I read. Next one is one you can probably guess. This one was published in 1897, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I've read the story of Dracula before, but I read it in its play form, so I haven't actually read the full like Bram Stoker Dracula. The next book I'm going to read, it was published in 1976, so we've jumped like almost 100 years at this point. So there's probably a lot missing between the two. Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. Obviously, I feel like I have to read this. It's so classic. Next one is one that I had no idea even existed until I went to do some research about it, and when I found it I was like, well, I have to read that. This was published in 1982 and it's Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. I had no clue that George R.R. Martin wrote a vampire novel, but I'm pretty excited to read it. It's not a typical plot that I would go for, but it was on a lot of lists of classic vampire novels. So the next one I have here, I'm just going to show you, it's Dead Until Dark by Charlaine Harris. And this is the book that True Blood, the TV show, was based off of. I've never been interested in True Blood, but I've also never even known what it was about. So here we go. I feel like this is like classic vampire literature that I have to read. I think this one is like a little bit more of a romance, but I'm not positive. The last book I have here to show you was published in September of 2005, about a month before Twilight ever came out. It's Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler. I had no idea Octavia Butler had a vampire novel. This is one that I'm really excited to read. I'm just gonna read the back. Shori is a mystery. Found alone in the woods, she appears to be a little black girl with traumatic amnesia and near-fatal wounds. But she's actually a 53-year-old vampire with ravenous hunger for blood, the lost child of an ancient species of near immortals who live in dark symbiosis with humanity. Genetically modified to be able to walk in daylight, Shori now becomes a target of a vast plot to destroy her and her kind. That sounds so good. Like, even if I wasn't doing this, I would read this if I had heard of it. We're getting a vampire novel about race, and we're also getting a vampire novel about like the human condition, I guess. Those are all the books I'm going to be reading. This has been a long intro, and I don't know how long this video is gonna end up. Hopefully you're going to see it at the end of March or maybe the beginning of April. I will update you when I start Carmilla. It'll probably be tomorrow because I still haven't finished the 5th season. I'll update you when I start Carmilla. I'm very excited. I will see you in the next clip. So I'm on the front camera, which is why this is backwards. I'm literally on the prologue and it already reminds me of Frankenstein. And if you haven't read Frankenstein, it's what is called a frame narrative. So it starts with a series of letters of this captain on a ship and his correspondence with his sister, if I recall correctly. They're positioned up at the beginning of the novel, but if you're thinking about the novel chronologically, the letters take place at the end. And so this already reminds me of it. It's basically whoever is narrating this prologue has found the rest of the book as like a document of what has happened with Carmilla, this vampire. Basically, this reminds me a lot of the frame narrative of Frankenstein, which is seen as like a really popular Gothic piece of literature, but Gothic literature is known to be like a late Romantic era literary genre, and the late Romantic era was the 1700s. But this wasn't written until the late 1800s, and Frankenstein was written in the early 1800s. So I need to look more into Gothic literature and like the rise of the vampire, just because this so distinctly so far reads like Frankenstein does. I'm only 3 pages in, but I have more to say. Basically, this is like so good so far. Our main character is a girl, and right now she's just like laying out the groundwork about what the world she lives in is like. She's introducing the setting and herself and the characters around her. Again, very Frankenstein. She likes to be solitary. It's a very Victor Frankenstein thing to be. It's also one of my favorite movies is Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman, and that is literally how I'm picturing this setting to look. And I'm glad that it's a female narrative. It's already like vampire watching you sleep. Sounds like Twilight, just saying. I am at work, but I finished Carmilla last night and I absolutely freaking loved it, but I will update you when I get home. I'm starting to get worried that no one will click on this video, and the people who do click on this video are gonna get bored. So hopefully this is interesting to people. I'm having a great time. So I finished Carmilla last night. I flew through it pretty fast. I can see people struggling with it a little bit. The language isn't as colloquial as we use now, so I can see it taking a little bit longer for some people. I'm a slow reader anyways, but I did finish this last night and I loved it. I thought it was really good. It was a lot more similar to Twilight than I ever expected, which was really strange. We got to that part of first, Carmilla was this, second, There were like 3 things I knew. It was very strange, very Twilight. Carmilla sneaking into Laura's room, very Twilight. Carmilla having a weird mysterious family, very Twilight. So I'm actually very curious to know how much like research Stephenie Meyer did about vampires before she wrote Twilight, or if she just like went for it and this is completely a coincidence. The only thing I didn't like about Carmilla was that at the end it gives you a little bit about this world of vampires and how vampires work, but we don't get much. And it also interested me that like vampires brought up and not a lot about vampires is explained, which leads me to believe that at the time that this was published, the story of the vampire was already established somehow. So I looked it up. I was like, what was the first ever written public story about vampires? And apparently, it was written the same night that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, or told Frankenstein. If you didn't know this, I feel like everyone knows this, but you might not. So when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, she was with her husband, Lord Byron, Percy Byron, I believe, and their friend, Dr. John Polidori, I don't know how to say it. So they were with their friend and they challenged each other to tell the scariest story they could think of. So Mary Shelley told the story of Frankenstein, which she later wrote and published and redacted and then republished. And Byron told a story that wasn't as interesting. And then their friend told a vampire story. And I can't quite figure out if vampires were still like a lore or a myth before this. I'm reading an article right now, I'll link down below. It's just on Wired. Previously, vampires had been creatures of folklore featuring in many cultures around the world, and the anecdotes about them collected by obsessives like Don Augustine Calmet and Montague Summers were mostly about smelly peasant revenants who seemed more like our present idea of the zombie. But when Polidori told it, he told it in more of how we know vampires today. I find that very interesting. So I would actually love to go back and read his story, which is just called The Vampire. I looked it up on Project Gutenberg. If you don't know, it's basically a database that has a bunch of free to the public classic literature on it. It's really helpful if you're looking for something that's free, and so I found it there. So I might go back and read it. I'm not super interested in it right now because the next book I'm going to read is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I also wanted to talk about how earlier I mentioned that Carmilla is told a lot like Frankenstein. I looked up a timeline of Gothic literature and it spans a lot longer than I thought it did. So Gothic is split up into 5 different segments. There's pre-Gothic, early Gothic, high Gothic, late Gothic, and post-Gothic. And post-Gothic is actually when most of the classic vampire novels were actually written. And if you're interested in, I guess, these timelines at all, I will leave a link to the website that I found down below. I'm gonna start Dracula, I guess. I'm gonna go looking for an audio recording on YouTube, and I will update you when I have something to update you on. So it's currently 12-ish a.m. on March 15th. I'm talking quietly because it's late. I kind of had a rough couple days dealing with this whole pandemic thing. The anxiety kind of got to me. I had a couple days off. Tomorrow I have a day off. So I think I'm just gonna take it easy tomorrow. But Dracula definitely was not keeping my attention whatsoever. The audiobook, it didn't even do anything for me, just the narration. I hate it. The plot, the pacing is so slow, and nothing has made me care about the characters whatsoever. So I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna start Interview with a Vampire and probably just read till I fall asleep, to be honest. I will talk to you more in the morning. So now my employer has closed for 10 days. So, I figure now I'm gonna get a lot of reading done. I did some pandemic painting today. This isn't done, and I'm also not a pro at watercolors, so don't judge me if you're an artist. If you're wondering, the ones I like to use are these little Jane Davenport ones. Comes in this little tin. Comes with like a fold-out palette, and it also comes with a card so that you can, what's that word? Swatch all the colors. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I DNF Dracula. It was dull. It was boring. I went to my friends and I was like, have you read Dracula? Is it this boring? And everyone I talked to was like, yeah, it's awful. So not gonna finish it. I am about halfway through Interview with a Vampire now. I am listening to the audiobook and I'm just almost done part 1. I don't like it. There's a lot of things about it that make me feel incredibly uncomfortable, like, Anne Rice, what are you doing with Claudia, and Louis and Lestat like kind of sexualize her a little bit, and that makes me really uncomfortable. I've seen the movie. I can't remember whether or not Claudia dies, but I'm hoping if she does that it comes soon because I am so uncomfortable. I take notes while I read because it helps me form thoughts when I go to do wrap up. I wrote, if there were a prequel novel for Twilight about Edward, it would read exactly like this. Also, the way that vampires become vampires in this book reminds me a lot of the Vampire Diaries. So much about this book reminds me of Twilight, and I realize like everything's been done with vampires, but I swear Stephanie Meyer read this book and then wrote Twilight. Because when we're talking about Claudette, like, it's so similar to the Volturi's Law about creating immortal children. Yeah, that's my update for now. Okay, so instead of you having to look at my face while I update, I figure I'll just play some Stardew Valley and tell you about how Interview with the Vampire is going. So we're in France. We found civilized vampires, but it's kind of weird. Like, it's kind of implying that the only civilized vampires are in France. Like, you have to be French. So I wonder if, like, is Anne Rice French? Like, did she purposely write, like, a pro-France novel? Does that make any sense? I don't know. It reads literally like an erotica novel. So we now know that male vampires can get it going. I don't monetize my videos, thank God. It makes me wonder if, like, can male vampires get humans pregnant? Like, is that a thing? But I'm listening to the audiobook and it's kind of weird now that it's like turned into an erotica novel, basically. I just wish there was like more action and less erotic tendencies to the storyline. I'm a bit curious to know what I know the second book is about Lestat. Oh my god, my chickens are freaking out. But I wonder, like, what exactly about him is it? Like, how he became a vampire? Because I would be interested in that, but not a whole novel. Like, oh, my inventory is full. I'd be interested if it was, like, maybe a short story or something. But otherwise, like, I'm not gonna read a whole other freaking Anne Rice novel. No, thank you. All right, what's in my mailbox? Some new items. Deluxe fishing pole. Thank God. I'm so bad at fishing. New recipe. God bless. Thanks, George. I want you all to know that I have made George my best friend. So far, he likes me the best. I was like, grumpy old man, let's be friends. Last night, I finished Interview with a Vampire. I think I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 5 stars. I definitely thought it was entertaining, but I also thought it was really dull in a lot of points. Like, the brooding going on with Louis is like kind of the worst. And if that was Stephanie Meyer's inspiration for Edward Cullen, I see it 100%. I did write down that the best sentence in the entire novel is in my copy. It's on page 283. How many vampires do you think have the stamina for immortality? And I was like, if that ain't the truth. That sentence itself doesn't happen till like much later, 283 pages into the book. But it's kind of the like theme throughout the whole book about like vampires are granted immortality, but how many of those actually have the stamina to be immortal. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I can see how it became such like a prominent vampire novel. So anyways, and the next book that I have to read now is Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. Also, Animal Crossing came out, so I've been playing that. I named my island Starfell because it took me a really long time to think of something. Here we go. That's what I look like. I don't even know what to say. The store that I work at closed. Then I got laid off. I'm still laid off. It's now April, and I haven't done any reading. The next book to talk about is Fever Dream, which is way over there. I started it, and then I got the audiobook so that I could listen to it while I play Animal Crossing, which is basically what I've been doing, is playing Animal Crossing. What I really need right now is something light and fun, something I know that I like, something that's easy for me to read. So I do want to read Twilight, and I figure it'll be a good refresher, like while I'm in the middle of my vampire book timeline. To be honest, my mental health kind of feels like it's deteriorating at this point. And I also recently made a discovery that I might have ADHD. So I'm finding like that really overwhelming. So that's how the vampire books have been going. I'm literally not even one chapter into Twilight. I'm on page 25, and I really didn't expect myself to have this many tabs, but I've read this book maybe the 25th time I've read this book. I'm noticing things that I've never noticed before, which I think I talked about this, like so much is blurring together because of this COVID shit. Like I don't remember if I talked about this last night, but the epigraph of Twilight, which if you don't know what an epigraph is, you know how sometimes authors will put like a quote at the beginning of their book. There's the contents, and then there's this little quote, and it's an epigraph. And it's a quote from the Bible, from Genesis. And I don't know a lot about the Bible. Most of the quotes I know from the Bible are either from when I went to church a handful of times as a child, and I'm now atheist, or it's from doing an undergrad in English and reading a lot of stuff that had references to biblical stories. Never noticed this before. We all know it's like public knowledge at this point that Stephenie Meyer's Mormon. My thinking is that like, is Stephenie Meyer trying to, because the apple has been uneaten, and then later in the, like within the story, within the book on page 19, there's a reference to Edward having an unbitten apple in front of him. And I'm like, oh my God, like, is this purposeful? Do we give Stephenie Meyer credit for being this clever? I read more into what that quote from the Bible actually means because I don't know the context of it. And so the context of it is that God creates the universe, and on the sixth day, he creates man. And he gives man free roam of the world, except for, there's one exception. He cannot, I guess, touch or eat from the tree of knowledge of the good and evil, or whatever it is. And so this is a quote from BibleRef.com. And I will leave a link below because I cite my sources. And they said, this simple prohibition underscores the Bible's basic view of sin and salvation. Mankind will not fall into sin because he fails to keep some impossibly long list of rules, nor will humanity fail because the restrictions are too demanding. Given near complete freedom and one single restriction, humanity will still choose to sin and therefore fail. So I'm like, what is she saying with this? Like, we will always choose to sin and we will always fail God in the eyes of people who are religious. and that's later why Jesus died for our sins. Like, my brain is going a mile a minute because, like, is she saying that Bella is is she agreeing? Because Edward has this whole like brooding thing throughout the entire series about how he is like a walking sin, basically, like, because he doesn't have a soul, because he's not human anymore. Is she like agreeing with him, or is she saying like Bella is about to discover the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What is she saying? So I'm on page 49. I'm realizing that one thing I haven't talked about yet is this idea that vampires have like specific abilities to like lure people. And so far, we haven't really seen anything explicitly like that. Not in Carmilla, not really an interview with a vampire. And so when Bella talks about like Edward dazzling her and them having these like supernatural abilities, like he reads minds, Alice sees the future, all that kind of stuff, we haven't actually seen that yet. And then I think of Vampire Diaries, where there's like a big plot line around compulsion. And so I think it'll be interesting to go from this back into Fever Dream, see what happens in here, and then into the other books to see kind of where that really starts to take more root. I look crazy. I just finished watching Schitt's Creek. I thought you all should know that. We out here. You really got a sunburn. I sat outside today reading, and then my mom and I went on a walk, and it was hot-ish, but it felt kind of cold, and so thus this ghastly sun. I mean, I've had so much worse than this. I finished Twilight. I made a lot of notes about how Edward and Louis in Interview with a Vampire are basically the same person. And I was like, oh, like, who else would be similar? And I guess if Louis is Edward, then the boy, the reporter, is Bella. Because, like, I think of the part, and I think it happens at the very end, and I think it happens somewhere in the middle as well, where the interviewer in Interview with a Vampire is like begging him to turn him into a vampire, and Louis is like, no, it's miserable, you wouldn't like it, I would never do that to someone, that kind of thing. And I was saying too, like, when we read Interview with a Vampire, I talked about how I read somewhere that it kind of represented like a shift in vampire literature where the vampire starts to take on like human qualities. Then that also made me think of the Vampire Diaries, because in the Vampire Diaries, we see how like Damon can like turn off his humanity, and in Twilight we see, I think it's Edward and Emmett both make some kind of statement about how like humans are funny, and like the little quips that humans have, and human emotion versus vampire emotion. So we really get the sense with vampires, this idea that like vampires they can remember their human lives, but they lose this like connection somewhere along the line to humanity. And I was thinking, is that because they feed on humans and therefore they have to disconnect themselves? But when it comes to vampires like Stefan Salvatore and the Cullens and the Denali's, that they no longer feed on humans. So they can be closer to humans, they can feel more human, but still Stephanie Meyer tells us Edward still feels a disconnect to humanity. I kind of wonder where that comes from and when that started. And I would think it would be Interview with a Vampire. And I want to know, is Stephanie Meyer the only one to do something other than Burned by the Sunlight? Because really, when it comes to Twilight, and is this because Stephanie Meyer is a bad writer and was so completely attached to her characters that she never wanted them to die, and so she barely gave anything that could kill a vampire? Or was that part of her thinking of the lore of her world? Did she really want vampires to be like the most invincible creature on the planet? When we hear Carlisle's story, we don't get to hear a lot of his story, and we never really get a good position of where he is in the vampire timeline. in Stephenie Meyer's world, because in Breaking Dawn, you learn that Vladimir and Stefan used to be part of the like ruling class of vampires, and that was when like monsters could still like wreak havoc on the world. But I wish we got a little bit more of like when Carlisle was turned into a vampire and then when the Volturi came into power. Was that before? Was that after? Because Carlisle was raised by a pastor and they knew that vampires were real. That's how Carlisle got turned, is that they were hunting vampires. So I'm wondering where that falls down like in the timeline of Stephenie Meyer's vampire world. That's where I'm at. Finished Twilight. Gonna kick off Fever Dream. I've already started reading it. I think tomorrow I'm gonna like grind, maybe listen to it while I puzzle. So stay tuned. I've been reading Fever Dream. I'm this far. I'm not quite halfway just yet, but I'm finding it a little bit difficult to read because it takes place in the 1850s in like Louisiana, New Orleans, like those kinds of places where slavery and plantations existed. And I get that. But like the gross mistreatment and objectification of women and the overuse of the N-word, and specifically the objectification and sexualization of Black women, just all of that and this was written in the 1980s, but just all of that combined makes it like hard to read in modern day. And basically what I'm saying is this book didn't age well, and like I get the context, but like it's so overused and like in a distasteful way, and it makes it really uncomfortable to read. So I'm almost done Fever Dream. I have about 70-ish pages left, but for the most part, like all of the like lore around like vampires and the plot has kind of already happened. I wasn't a huge fan of this, but I have ended up really enjoying the story. I think at this point I'm probably gonna give it a 3 out of 5 stars, because you know, those bits still kind of leave me a little bit uneasy, but I do like the plot, and I do really like what George R.R. Martin has done with the legend of like vampirism. I finally understand why on the back it says a thrilling reinvention of the vampire novel by the master of modern fantasy, because George R.R. Martin has completely like, I feel like he really did his research, and that's what makes it good. That's what makes it believable. Honestly, it feels like kind of a quick read. Like once you get into it, it feels like 100 pages go by and you've only been reading for 5 minutes. When you start reading a vampire novel, you know it's a vampire novel, and you catch on pretty quickly who is a vampire and who isn't. And that's something that I actually don't really enjoy about vampire novels, because they spend all this time being like, I'm not a vampire, and then like halfway through the book they're like, actually I lied, and we're like, yeah, we know. Just get on with it. You finally find out like the person that you thought was a vampire is a vampire, and he like tells his story, which is another very common like trope that's used in vampire novels, is that like the vampire gets this like long period of the book to be able to like tell their origin story. In the case of Interview with a Vampire, it's like the entire book. George R.R. Martin like took all of like witches, werewolves, vampires, warlocks, ghosts, he took all of those tropes and fit them into the creatures that exist in this world. They don't call themselves vampires, even though they are predominantly what we would think of as vampires. They don't consider themselves that. I think my favorite part about it is that instead of creating vampires, creating other vampires out of humans, vampires are able to breed. And then every month, kind of by the phases of the moon, they are like incapacitated by what they call the red thirst, which is like them needing to drink blood, basically. He did his research. He talks about like, this is where humans came from and this is where vampires came from. and it's grounded in like Christian religion. Another thing that I wanted to say that I don't think I got to say earlier was about the main character in Fever Dream, Abner Marsh, as human. And so far in all of these books, the main like narrator protagonist character has been human, and they've kind of been like the odd one out type of human. Like Bella, we talk about how she is like not like other girls, if you will. She's like boring and kind of, she thinks of herself as like pretty drab and all that. And then we look at Carmilla, and that main character, she lives in this big mansion with her father, and she's really isolated. She doesn't have a lot of friends. And then we get to Fever Dream, and we see Abner Marsh, who like is described as not a conventionally attractive man. And all of these human narrators that we see are like so fiercely confident in their ability to be able to like conquer a vampire when they're not confident in any other aspect in their life, which I think is really interesting. And I see that mostly between Abner Marsh and Fever Dream, and then Bella in Twilight. I think that's really interesting, that kind of trope of, if you're gonna have a human main character in a vampire novel, they can't be scared of the vampires. So I finished Fever Dream, and I mean, I've kind of already said how I feel about it. I think I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 4. There were a few things that just kind of left me a little bit uneasy. I get like the historical context and whatever, and it made sense in that respect, but that didn't mean that I wasn't uncomfortable, and I do want to knock a star off for that because this was written in the 80s, and I don't know, I just feel like that part of it could have been better done. But I think that the lore of vampirism that George R.R. Martin builds in this book is like kind of amazing, and I'm really glad I read this because it's something that I don't think I'm gonna get from any other vampire book. The next one I'm gonna read is Dead Until Dark, which I mentioned before is what this TV series True Blood is based off of. So I'm gonna read that next. And it's actually, I feel like it's pretty short. So I'm curious to see what Dead Until Dark does, because we're going from 1982 to 2001, so a good 20 years. From Interview to Fever Dream, there was about 10-ish years, so, and we saw a lot of differences. So I'm gonna jump into Dead Until Dark right away, I think, because I'm just really curious about it. But I just read more of the back of Dead Until Dark before I jumped into like reading it. The main character can read minds, and then a vampire comes along and she can't read his mind. Isn't that the premise of Twilight? So I'm here in this horrible lighting to update you about Dead Until Dark. I'm hating it so far. I'm almost done. I'm like less than 100 pages from the end. I think it's one of the worst books I've ever read, just like to put that out there, like writing wise, narrative wise, story wise, plot wise. I think it's lazy. I think it's bad. Me calling this like dumpster fire garbage, someone might feel the same way about Twilight. So I guess I can't say too much to that. As soon as the main character showed like an ounce of homophobia, I was like, okay, I officially do not like this. There's like a weird reference to AIDS and like vampires getting AIDS and it being really deadly to them, and like I just thought that was like super insensitive and I hated it. So I did more research into the author, and like I don't think I like her either. I can do unlikable main characters. I've done it before, but I think we're supposed to like Suki or Suki. I don't really know how you say her name. I just don't like her. Vampires are like integrated into like human society, like humans know about them. Like officially vampires are vampires because of like a virus, whereas like that's not how it happens. To create a vampire, you drain the human and then you feed them your blood, and then they like incubate for 3 days, 2 to 3 days, and then they wake up as a vampire. It's also like classic vampire in that they burn in the sunlight, they sleep in like graves. They can't be around silver or garlic or churches. So far, there's another character that hasn't been revealed as supernatural yet, but I'm pretty sure he's a werewolf. It's very similar to The Coldest Girl in Cold Town, which I didn't plan on talking about in this video, but I guess it's just gonna happen, by Holly Black, which is a teen vampire book. It has the same vibes because like people know about vampires. They're like kind of sinister. They kind of live like isolated lives compared to everyone. Coldest Girl in Cold Town was released in 2013, which I think is interesting. Another like problematic thing that I hated was that because the main character is human and she can read minds, she calls her ability a disability. Which, not into that. A lot of people have disabilities, and that is not being able to read minds, so thanks so much, but we're gonna kick that to the curb. I'm gonna be glad to finish this. If you like this book, I'm sorry, but I hate it. And also, I'm sorry that my calendar is still at March. I just haven't changed it yet. So I finished Dead Until Dark, and I'm gonna give it 1 out of 5 stars. I just didn't enjoy it. I'm gonna move on to Fledgling. This is like the one that I've really been excited to read because in all of my research, this was the one that I found that's like a classic vampire novel that's also written by like a woman of color. I don't think it'll take me very long, but I've never read an Octavia Butler, so I don't know what her writing style is like, so we shall see. I haven't read anything because I don't feel like it, but today I did put up a new desk and shelves. I'll show you. Don't mind my dirty plate. Here she is in all of her glory. I even put my diploma up. Literally took all day. My arms are sore, my back hurts. I feel like an old woman. It took all freaking day to get this thing up because it's wall mounted, so it was a lot of measuring and like finding studs, and I woke up and my knees were in a lot more pain than they usually are. If you don't know, I have chronic pain in my knees because my kneecap is not in line with my joint. It's a whole thing. Don't feel like I feel like I could go to bed right now, and it's only 9, so that's how my day's been. We need to talk about Fledgling because I have a lot to say. I'm about 80 pages in, page 79, 80 pages, whatever. And it's so hard to concentrate on the execution and the plot and the lore of vampirism that Octavia Butler has tried to set up, because there's like I thought it might go away and it's not. There's this like relationship that the main character gets into, and the main character, I mean, it says it on the back, the main character is like 50 years old, she's a vampire, but she's perceived to be about like 11 years old, and she wakes up with amnesia, and the first human she runs into, she feeds off of him, and literally they almost immediately have sex. And I just like, it's so like, we know that that's disgusting, and it reminds me again of Interview with a Vampire, and they have this like weird relationship because her brain continues to age but her body does not. And in Fledgling, we found out that like vampires still age and die. It just takes a longer period of time. So she's 50, but she looks 11. But when she turns like 70, she'll be around like 16 or maybe 18 or something. I think I'm frustrated because like I was so looking forward to this being about like a conversation around race. And it is, because the main character, she is like a vampire experiment where they're trying to see if they create black vampires, the sun will have less effect on them, which is exactly what the main character is. She's black and the sun has less effect on her as a vampire because of it. So yeah, I'm finding it hard to like concentrate on the other parts of the book because I don't like that part. Okay, so I'm almost done reading Fledgling. I'm literally like maybe 5 chapters from the end. And I don't think I like it, which I'm pretty disappointed about because I was so looking forward to it. I don't like the narration at all. It's first person, but it's also from someone who has amnesia. So it's I just don't like narrators with amnesia in general because I think it's boring. So I went to Goodreads to see like how other people felt about it. And one of my friends on Goodreads rated it a 3.5 stars, but I think they made a good point. I'll quote it. I found the main character difficult to stomach. Her narration is short, straightforward, matter-of-fact. Her description of her thoughts are unweighed by emotion, and when she does experience emotion, she makes it known to the reader with declarative statements. This changes slowly, iteratively, as the book continues, a testament to the skill of the author as the character comes into her new self, understanding what can be conveyed and how to do it, which I think is interesting because I definitely agree with that. At the beginning, it's like very, again, short, matter-of-fact statements about what's going on. And then slowly throughout the book, she starts to come into her own because she can't remember anything. So she doesn't like have a personality to go off of. So it's hard to like get into the plot and like really connect with the characters and really understand what's going on because we're focused on this main character that has amnesia and isn't a great narrator for the story. When you read the blurbs and everything, it's kind of hyped up to be a vampire book about race and politics, and there's not enough of that. And I think that again goes back to the narration, and I think the narration is a detriment to the storytelling. I will say the lore that we do get and that we're made to understand reminds me a lot of Fever Dream. Humans were created and then vampires were created, and how like it's a big plot in this that they mingle together, but like in secret. They have their own communities made up of vampires and humans that they feed off of and have like relationships with. So that's kind of interesting. That reminds me a lot of Fever Dream in the like origin story of vampires, and the way that like these vampires procreate. They can't change humans into vampires, but the humans that they have relationships with and that they feed off of, they're like symbiotic relationships with, do live longer than other humans do, which I think is really interesting. So the time has come. I have finished the vampire novels. I have to tell you about Fledgling because I finished it. Then we're gonna wrap them all up and talk about what we learned. So Fledgling, I finished. Oh my god, I put it at the bottom of the pile. Why did I do that? I think I'm gonna give this a 2 out of 5 stars, which is to say that I hated the plot because there was no plot, and I didn't like the narration, but I liked the lore that Octavia Butler created, and I liked the world that she created. And honestly, I kind of wish this were a series, because if it were, I think I would continue just to see like Shori, the main character, and like her fully fledged form and her full personality acting in this new world that she's come into. Do you think that there is something to be said about the vampire world and race? I liked that this tried to incorporate it. I just wish there were more books like this because I enjoyed that aspect of it, but there wasn't enough of it for me to really be able to immerse myself in it. Now on to, I'm gonna wrap these up. First book I read was Carmilla. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really engaging and I loved the storytelling, even though I'm pretty sure it's a translation. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Actually, out of all of these, this is the one that I rated the highest. I think it's because it gives like it is a classic. It gives a classic feel to vampires. It feels super gothic and horror-like. Just like really the vibes of vampires that I crave personally. That's kind of the opposite of Twilight, but I love this like classic feel to a vampire story. Also in Carmilla, we get like an introduction into vampires and kind of the classic tropes that go along with a vampire story. Mainly some kind of isolation, a small town, which in this one is literally just the main character and her father living in like a mansion, and there are like very few people that wait after them, and then Carmilla comes along. So this kind of first introduces that like isolated horror gothic type of setting, but it also introduces the compelling erotic nature of vampirism and the way that vampires act. We don't get a lot of lore of vampires in this one. We mostly just get that they drink blood and they can't go out in the sunlight, and that their prey, the people that they feed on, are like very attracted to them, not just physically but also like emotionally attracted to them, like they crave their presence kind of thing. The book I read was Dracula by Bram Stoker. I didn't finish this one. I got not very far in. This is a long, boring book. It's told through journal entries and letters, and I don't like books like that. And I talked to a lot of other people that didn't finish this either, and the people that did finish it said it was really boring. As I mentioned, I did read the play when I was in high school, and I've seen the like black and white movie, so I do have a particular grasp on it. Like, I know the story, I know the characters, I know the plot, I know what happens. And I hate the original. So moving on, next I read Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, which I would say is still the most popular modern classic of vampire stories. This was written in 1976. And as I've mentioned numerous times, this is kind of where we start to get like the human side to vampires. And I also found that, especially compared to Carmilla and the small bits of Dracula that I know, this like really amps it up on the eroticism. Like, there's a lot going on that has to do with emotional and especially physical connection and what a vampire's bite can do to you and the way it feels and all that. So this is kind of where I found that really took off. Relationships were kind of strange. I hated the narration. Louis can choke. He's so boring and so brooding. And I think that's like kind of a trope of vampire literature, is this main vampire character is usually like pretty depressed about life. They're very brooding. They're always reflecting back on what they've done and what they think they can do better as, and what ounce of humanity they have left they focus on, stuff like that. I think this is interesting, and it's definitely in the vampire literary canon for a reason, but that doesn't mean I liked it. That doesn't mean that I think it's like my favorite vampire book, because it's definitely not. And I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars, but I think I would be willing to bump it down to like a 2.5. I started to feel like a reading slump coming along, so I just dove into Twilight, and as you can see, I had a great time doing it. I filled this baby up with notes. Edward is so much like Louis in Interview. He's so brooding, but this is kind of where I think there becomes like a specific sub-genre of vampire horror fiction, because in this it's not really horror, it's not really gothic, it's just kind of like a love story. There's a lot of biblical reference in this, which I didn't expect at all. And I had never noticed reading this the thousands of other times that I've read it. Lately, when I've been reading this, I've been giving it like a 3-star, but honestly, like, I think Stephanie Meyer is smarter than we give her credit for. Like, yeah, her characters are deeply flawed and not well written, but I think she's smarter than we give her credit for, and I actually might bump my rating from this to a 4-star. So then I read Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin, and I think out of all of these, this one is the one that surprised me the most. I complained about it a lot while I was reading it, and about the amount of racism and violence against women and Black women that we find in this book made me very uncomfortable. But I also really enjoyed this. I think if we took out all the very lengthy descriptions of steamboats and maybe cut back on the racism and violence against women and Black women a little bit, then maybe I would rate this a little bit higher. I give this 3 out of 5 stars, because I thought it was good. I thought George R. R. Martin was really smart. He did his research. This is so different. And it does still play on the tropes, like vampires are nomadic, isolating creatures. They're pretty brooding. Emotions are really heightened. They feel things a little bit differently, which we see in Twilight as well. I think this is really interesting and I would actually really recommend it. I'd probably recommend the audiobook first, and that way you can tune out the very long and lengthy descriptions of steamboats that I did not find interesting whatsoever. And then the worst book that I read during this, and probably the worst book I've ever read, is Dead Until Dark. I gave this a 1 out of 5 stars. First person narration was not it. It was so bad. And then last but not least, I read Fledgling, which we just talked about, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot. This was a lot like Fever Dream. It adhered to a lot of the rules and I guess politics that Fever Dream kind of sets up, and this one takes it a little bit farther with the politics, and we kind of get introduced to this like court system and all of these rules that people just kind of follow. It's not like Twilight where there is like a vampire police. Instead, it's like a jury of your peers, a court of your peers kind of thing. I'm rating this, I guess I'm rating it like a 2 or 2.5 out of 5 stars. I think that's really where I sit with it. I didn't like it more than I liked it. I'm not totally sure what the point of this was anymore. I guess I just kind of explained what the point of it was, just to kind of like cross-reference vampire literature and see what the similarities and differences were, all leading up to what Twilight is based off of. I think if I were to read more vampire books in this way, I would go back to like classic YA stuff like Blue Bloods, House of Night, those kinds of series to get a better idea of like Twilight and its impact on the vampire world, whereas with this I was kind of seeing what led up to Twilight. I don't know how interesting this was. I don't know how many people will watch this far into the video. I don't even know how long this video is going to be in the first place. So if you have watched the whole thing, thank you so much. It was interesting for me. I had a lot of fun doing it. If you have any recommendations of vampire books, I would love to hear them. I hope you're all safe, I hope you're all healthy, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next one.